Have you ever faced a situation so impossible that victory seemed completely out of reach? Imagine standing on a battlefield. The enemy stretches across the horizon like a sea of warriors. Their weapons glisten under the sun. Their numbers are overwhelming. Every calculation says defeat is certain. Now, imagine God looking at your tiny army and saying, "You have too many soldiers." Too many? That is exactly what happened in one of the most astonishing stories in the Bible. This is the story of Gideon, a man who discovered that when God is on your side, numbers don't matter. And by the end of this story, you'll understand why sometimes God reduces your resources before he reveals his power. Let's begin. The nation of Israel was living in fear. For 7 long years, the Midianites had terrorized the land. Every time the Israelites planted crops, the Midianites would invade. They would sweep through the fields like locusts, stealing food, destroying harvests, and leaving families hungry. The people were exhausted. They hid in caves. They hid in mountains. They hid wherever they could find safety. The mighty nation that God had delivered from Egypt was now living like fugitives in its own land. But there was a deeper problem. Israel had drifted away from God. They had forgotten his commands. They had trusted in idols instead of trusting in him. And as often happened, their rebellion led them into suffering. Finally, after years of oppression, the people cried out to God, and God heard them. Far from the battlefield, in a small village, a young man named Gideon was secretly threshing wheat. Normally, wheat was processed in an open area where the wind could separate the grain from the chaff. But Gideon was hiding. He was afraid the Midianites would steal what little food remained. As he worked, something extraordinary happened. An angel of the Lord appeared before him. The angel looked at this frightened farmer and said, "The Lord is with you, mighty warrior." Mighty warrior? Gideon probably looked around to see if the angel was talking to someone else. He didn't feel like a warrior. He felt weak, afraid, insignificant. Yet God saw something in Gideon that Gideon could not see in himself. Maybe someone listening today needs to hear that. God sees more in you than you see in yourself. He sees strength where you see weakness, purpose where you see confusion, victory where you see impossibility. The angel told Gideon that God had chosen him to save Israel. Gideon was stunned. He immediately began listing reasons why he was the wrong person. "My clan is the weakest. I am the least in my family." In other words, "God, surely you have the wrong man." But God answered with a simple promise. "I will be with you." That was all Gideon needed, because God's presence is more powerful than human ability. Soon, Gideon began gathering soldiers. Word spread throughout Israel. Men came from every direction. By the time they assembled, Gideon had an army of 32,000 soldiers. It sounded impressive until they looked at the enemy. The Midianite army was enormous. Scripture describes them as countless as locusts. Their camels covered the valley like grains of sand on the seashore. Historians estimate the enemy force may have exceeded 10,000 soldiers. Even with 32,000 men, Gideon was heavily outnumbered. But then, God said something shocking. "You have too many men." Too many? God explained why. If Israel won with 32,000 soldiers, they might believe they achieved victory through their own strength. They might take credit for what God was about to do. So God began reducing the army. First, he announced that anyone who was afraid could go home. Immediately left. Just like that, 2/3 of the army disappeared. Only aimed. Can you imagine Gideon watching them leave? His army was shrinking before the battle even began. But God wasn't finished. He said again, "There are still too many men." Then God led Gideon to a stream of water. The soldiers were told to drink. Some knelt down and buried their faces in the water. Others scooped water into their hands while remaining alert. God chose only the men who remained watchful. The result? Only 300 soldiers were left. 300 against an army of more than 135,000. The odds were staggering. Approximately 450 enemy soldiers for every one Israelite warrior. Humanly speaking, defeat was guaranteed. Yet, God was setting the stage for a miracle. That night, God gave Gideon another gift: encouragement. God told him to sneak into the enemy camp and listen. As Gideon approached, he overheard a Midianite soldier describing a dream. In the dream, a loaf of barley bread rolled into the camp and collapsed a tent. Another soldier immediately interpreted it. This can only mean one thing: God has given Gideon victory over Midian. Think about that. Before the battle even began, fear had already entered the enemy camp. God was working behind the scenes. And perhaps He is doing the same in your life right now. Even when you cannot see it, even when nothing seems to be changing, God is already moving. Strengthened by what he heard, Gideon returned to his men, but instead of handing them swords and spears, he gave them something unexpected: a trumpet, an empty jar, and a torch hidden inside the jar. Imagine being one of those soldiers. You are facing a massive army, and your commander hands you a musical instrument and a clay pot. It made no military sense, but God's plans rarely depend on human logic. They depend on obedience. Under the cover of darkness, Gideon's 300 men surrounded the enemy camp. At the exact moment Gideon commanded, they blew their trumpets. They smashed their jars, and they shouted, "A sword for the Lord and for Gideon." Suddenly, the night exploded with sound and light, and the Midianites woke in confusion. They thought a massive army had surrounded them. Panic spread through the camp. Fear turned into chaos. Chaos turned into disaster. The Midianites began attacking one another. In the darkness, they could not tell friend from foe. The very army that seemed unstoppable destroyed itself. The survivors fled. Israel pursued them. And God delivered a miraculous victory. Not because of military strength, not because of superior numbers, not because of human strategy, but because God intervened. The battle belonged to Him. And that brings us to the powerful lesson of Gideon's story. Sometimes God allows us to face impossible odds so that His power becomes undeniable. Sometimes He removes our backup plans. Sometimes He reduces our resources. Sometimes He leads us into situations where victory seems impossible. Why? Because when the breakthrough comes, there will be no doubt about who deserves the glory. The world says bigger is better. More money, more resources, more influence, more strength. But God often works differently. He specializes in impossible situations. He uses small beginnings. He uses ordinary people. He uses unlikely circumstances. And He turns them into testimonies of His power. Maybe today you feel outnumbered by problems, outnumbered by fear, outnumbered by challenges. Remember Gideon's story. One man with God is always a majority. The same God who fought for Gideon still fights for His people today. The same God who turned weakness into victory still works miracles. The same God who transformed fear into faith is able to do the same for you. When everyone else says it's impossible, God says, "Watch what I can do." because the greatest victories are often born from the most impossible battles. If this story encourages your faith, be sure to subscribe and join us for more powerful Bible stories that reveal God's faithfulness through every trial. And remember, the size of your obstacle does not determine the size of your victory. The size of your God does. Thank you for watching, and God bless you.